The snow descended in thick, relentless waves, a swirling white curtain that enveloped the city, transforming it into an unforgiving, silent expanse. The streets, normally bustling with life, lay deserted, the world hushed and still beneath the oppressive weight of the storm. Only the faint, uneven footsteps of a dying soldier, a German shepherd, broke the eerie silence. His once powerful body, now battered and bleeding, pushed forward with a sheer, unwavering willpower that defied the elements. Each ragged breath was a struggle, each agonizing step a testament to his determination. Yet he refused to yield, his resolve as solid as the frozen ground beneath his paws. Hanging limply from his jaws was a tiny frostbitten puppy, its frail body barely stirring, its life hanging by a fragile thread. Through the blinding cold and the swirling snow, the dog's vision blurred, his eyes struggling to focus. Yet a distant glow caught his attention. It was a hospital, a beacon of hope in the desolate landscape, a place where humans waged a tireless battle against death. He had witnessed their miraculous work before, watched as their skilled hands brought life back from the brink of oblivion. Would they extend the same compassion to her? Would they understand his desperate plea, the silent language of his suffering? His paw, once strong and swift, now faltered on the treacherous, icy ground. But he pressed on, driven by an instinct more powerful than pain. He had to reach them. He had no other choice. At last, he reached the towering glass doors, their smooth surface a stark contrast to the rough, unforgiving terrain he had traversed. His body trembled violently, his muscles screaming in agony, as he gently laid the puppy down on the frozen pavement, his movements tender and careful. Blood dripped from his wounds, staining the pristine snow beneath him, a stark reminder of his sacrifice. He raised his weary head, his eyes pleading, and let out a sound that was neither bark nor growl, just raw, desperate pain, a primal cry for help. Inside, a security guard sat at his post, sipping coffee to ward off the biting chill of the night, his gaze fixed on the empty lobby. Suddenly, he noticed movement outside, a flicker of motion in the swirling snow. His breath hitched in his throat as he witnessed the scene unfolding before him. A dog, bleeding and nearly collapsing, a tiny pup unmoving at his feet. For a second, disbelief froze him in place, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't supposed to happen. The shepherd let out another weak whimper, his gaze fixed on the door, his paw scratching at the glass in a desperate plea, before his legs finally gave out, his body slumping against the glass, his breathing shallow and labored. The guard hesitated, his mind battling with conflicting impulses. Rules were rules, but this was something different, something that transcended the boundaries of protocol, and what happened next would leave the world in disbelief. The hospital was built to save human lives, not animals. The rules were clear. No pets, no exceptions. But outside, bleeding and trembling, the German shepherd refused to accept that fate. His battered paw scraped weakly against the glass doors, his breath fogging up the surface in desperate, fading bursts. Each exhale a testament to his dwindling strength. His body swayed, exhaustion threatening to pull him under, to extinguish the last flicker of his resolve, yet he didn't back down. He couldn't, not with the tiny, unmoving puppy at his feet, its fragile life hanging in the balance. Inside the brightly lit lobby, a world of quiet urgency buzzed with activity. Nurses shuffling papers, their movements swift and efficient. Doctors moving between patients, their faces etched with concern, their focus unwavering. The sterile hum of monitors and the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment filled the brightly lit hospital corridor, a stark contrast to the chaotic scene unfolding just outside the glass doors. Inside, a world of quiet urgency prevailed. Nurses and doctors, moving with practiced efficiency, their focus unwavering. No one seemed to notice the dark, huddled figure pressed against the frosted glass, until a security guard, positioned near the main entrance, narrowed his eyes, his gaze drawn to the unusual sight. At first, he assumed the dog was merely seeking shelter from the relentless storm, a temporary reprieve from the biting wind and swirling snow. But then, his eyes registered the blood, thick, dark streaks painting the pristine steps behind the canine, a stark crimson trail leading to the glass doors. His heart clenched with a sudden sharp pang of concern as he noticed the small, almost imperceptible bundle clutched within the dog's jaws. A puppy, its tiny form barely moving, its life hanging precariously in the balance, perhaps already extinguished. He turned, his voice hesitant, calling out to the nearest nurse, interrupting her hurried stride. There's a dog out here," he stammered, his words laced with disbelief. "He's hurt. He's got a puppy with him. I think—" He swallowed, his throat tightening. "I think they're dying." A few nurses glanced towards the doors, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, uncertainty, and a flicker of professional detachment. "We can't bring a dog inside," one of them muttered, her voice tinged with a hint of apologetic resignation. "It's against policy." Another nurse, her hand already reaching for the phone, suggested, "Someone call animal control." But then, amidst the hesitant murmurs and the bureaucratic pronouncements, one voice cut through the noise, clear and resolute. "No, look at him," she insisted, her tone laced with urgency. "He's begging for help." Emily, a young nurse with kind eyes and a heart that refused to be hardened by the harsh realities of her profession, stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the desperate scene outside. She ignored the doubtful whispers and disapproving glances behind her, her focus unwavering. She had witnessed pain before, had seen patients clinging to life by the thinnest of threads, their eyes filled with the same desperate, unspoken plea she now saw in the dog's weary gaze. It wasn't just physical pain, it was something deeper, a primal instinct, a father's desperate plea for his child. Ignoring the disapproving glances and the unspoken reprimands, Emily reached for the door handle, her movements swift and decisive. As the heavy glass door swung open, the German shepherd took one staggering step forward, his legs buckling beneath him, his body too drained to fight any longer. He crumpled to the ground, his body surrendering to exhaustion, his strength finally depleted. The puppy slipped from his jaws, rolling lifelessly onto the cold, unforgiving floor. A collective gasp filled the air, a moment of stunned silence as the reality of the situation sank in. For a moment, time stood still, suspended in the gravity of the moment. The shepherd let out one last, weak whimper, a final plea for help, before his body stilled completely, his breath fading into silence. Emily dropped to her knees beside him, her movements frantic, pressing trembling fingers to his bloodied fur, searching for a sign of life. He was still breathing, but barely, his breath shallow and ragged. So was the puppy, its tiny chest rising and falling with faint, almost imperceptible movements. "Get help!" she shouted, her voice filled with urgency, her eyes pleading for assistance. Another nurse hesitated, her gaze darting between Emily and the lifeless forms on the floor. "Emily, we can't. We have to!" she snapped, her voice sharp with desperation. "Just look at them!" The security guard, his face etched with concern, was already reaching for his radio, calling for assistance, his voice urgent and unwavering. The hospital staff stood frozen, torn between the rigid adherence to rules and the raw, heartbreaking reality unfolding before them. This wasn't just an injured dog. This was a father who had fought through unimaginable pain, carried his child through the storm, and used his last breath to bring her to safety. And now, it was up to them to decide. Do they let them die, adhering to the letter of the law? Or do they break the rules and fight for them, embracing the spirit of compassion? Emily's hands trembled as she pressed her fingers against the tiny puppy's chest, willing her to take another breath, her touch gentle yet urgent. The small body was so light, barely more than skin and fragile bones, and frighteningly cold, its temperature dangerously low. The pup's ribs barely moved with each shallow inhale, each breath a fragile, tenuous gasp. Her fur, once soft and fluffy, was stiff with frost and clumps of dried blood, a testament to the harsh conditions they had endured. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "Come on, little one," she whispered, her voice laced with desperation. "Stay with me." Her gaze shifted to the father dog, his body a tableau of suffering. Blood pooled around him, staining the pristine hospital floor, a stark crimson contrast to the sterile white. His wounds were deep, jagged gashes, some still oozing fresh blood, others caked with dried crimson, evidence of a brutal struggle. His fur was matted, torn in places, revealing raw, exposed skin, evidence of a brutal struggle. Had he fought another animal, a predator, or something worse? Yet, through all of it, he had made it here, driven by an unwavering instinct. He had carried this tiny life in his jaws, refusing to give up, even now, as his body lay motionless, his spirit seemingly extinguished. His chest barely rising, he stirred at her touch, a faint tremor rippling through his weakened frame. A weak whimper, a mere ghost of a sound, escaped his cracked lips, a testament to the pain he endured. And then, his eyes, those deep, pain-filled eyes, fluttered open, just enough to find hers, to lock onto her gaze. In that fleeting moment, Emily saw a universe of emotion. Pain, raw and unrelenting. Trust, fragile yet unwavering. And a silent plea, a desperate question that hung unspoken, in the air. Emily felt something inside her shatter, a dam breaking, releasing a torrent of emotions she hadn't realized she held back. She fumbled for her phone with blood-streaked fingers, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat. She dialed, her fingers trembling, her mind racing. "Pick up, pick up, pick up," she whispered, her voice a desperate plea against the silence. A groggy voice finally crackled through the line, a voice thick with sleep. "Emily, it's past midnight. What is it?" "Ben," she said, her voice strained. "I need you at the hospital now." "What?" "The hospital." The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Carter, her longtime friend and a skilled veterinarian, a man whose dedication to animals was as profound as her own. "Emily, It's an emergency," she cut in, her voice sharp with urgency, a desperate plea against time. "A German shepherd, he's in bad shape, bleeding out, and there's a puppy, hypothermic, barely breathing. If you don't come now, they'll die." A brief silence hung heavy in the air, a moment of tense anticipation, then a resigned sigh. "I'm on my way." Relief flooded her for a fleeting second, a wave of gratitude washing over her, but she knew the battle was far from over. Behind her, voices began rising, a chorus of disapproval and bureaucratic resistance. "This is a hospital, not a vet clinic." A senior doctor, Dr. Reynolds, scowled, his voice laced with disdain. "We have real patients to treat." Another nurse chimed in, her tone laced with exasperation. "We're barely keeping up with human emergencies as it is. We can't use resources on a dog." Emily's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white with anger, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "And what do you think he is?" she shot back, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "He's a police dog, a soldier. He's saved lives, protected people like us. And now he's here, dying, asking for our help." She motioned to the tiny, unmoving body beside him, her voice breaking with emotion. "And that puppy, she wouldn't have made it this far without him. He carried her through the storm. He fought for her when no one else would." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Some doctors still looked skeptical, their faces etched with doubt, others uncomfortable, their gazes averted. But then, the shepherd stirred again, a faint tremor running through his weakened body, his muscles tensed, his body trembling from weakness. Yet with the last of his strength, he lifted his head, his dull eyes scanning the room, taking in the faces around him. He didn't fight, he didn't growl, he just looked, his gaze searching for understanding, for compassion. And when his gaze found Emily's again, something inside her cracked wide open. The weight of that look, filled with pain, trust, and a silent question, made her throat tighten, her eyes welling with tears. She dropped to her knees beside him, running a shaking hand through his blood-matted fur, her touch gentle and reassuring. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise." He exhaled shakily, a ragged breath that seemed to carry the weight of his ordeal, as if holding on to that promise, as if he believed in her more than she believed in herself. And in that moment, Emily made a decision, a vow that transcended rules and regulations. Forget the rules, forget the debate. She wasn't going to let them die. Dr. Carter burst through the hospital doors, his coat half-buttoned, his face tense with urgency, a whirlwind of focused energy. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air as he rushed toward the scene, his breath catching at the sight before him. The German shepherd lay sprawled on the cold floor, his fur matted with blood, his chest rising in slow, ragged breaths. Beside him, the tiny puppy lay motionless, its body frighteningly still, its fragile life hanging by a thread. Without hesitation, Carter dropped to his knees, pulling open his bag, his hands moving quickly, trained by years of experience, a symphony of practiced movements. But beneath his focused exterior, there was an underlying sense of dread, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. He had seen dogs in rough shape before, but something about this one felt different, a sense of urgency that transcended the physical wounds. "We need to stabilize them," he muttered, his voice low and urgent, checking the shepherd's pulse. "He's in bad shape, but he's a fighter." Emily nodded, her eyes filled with determination, pressing gauze against the shepherd's worst wounds, her touch gentle yet firm. For the puppy, Carter placed 2 fingers against her tiny ribcage, waiting, listening for the faintest sign of life. For a moment, nothing. Then the faintest flutter beneath his fingertips, a fragile pulse, a whisper of life. "She's barely holding on," he murmured, his voice laced with concern. "We need warmth, fluids." As he moved, his fingers brushed against something cold and hard, something that didn't belong. His chest barely rising, he stirred at her touch, a weak whimper escaping his cracked lips, and then his eyes, those deep, pain-filled eyes, fluttered open, just enough to find hers, to lock onto her gaze. Pain, trust, a silent plea. The emotions swirling in those eyes were a crushing weight. Emily felt something inside her shatter. She fumbled for her phone with blood-streaked fingers, her heart pounding against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat. "Pick up, pick up, pick up," she whispered, her voice a desperate plea. A groggy voice finally crackled through the line. "Emily, it's past midnight. What is it?" "Ben, I need you at the hospital now." "What?" "The hospital." The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Carter, her longtime friend and a skilled veterinarian. "Emily, it's an emergency," she cut in, her voice sharp with urgency. "A German shepherd. He's in bad shape, bleeding out, and there's a puppy, hypothermic, barely breathing. If you don't come now, they'll die." A brief silence, then a resigned sigh. "I'm on my way." Relief flooded her, but the battle was far from over. Behind her, voices began rising. "This is a hospital, not a vet clinic." A senior doctor, Dr. Reynolds, scowled. "We have real patients to treat." Another nurse chimed in. "We're barely keeping up with human emergencies as it is. We can't use resources on a dog." Emily's hands clenched into fists. "And what do you think he is?" she shot back, her voice trembling with fury. "He's a police dog, a soldier. He's saved lives, protected people like us. And now he's here, dying, asking for our help." She motioned to the tiny, unmoving body beside him. And that puppy, she wouldn't have made it this far without him. He carried her through the storm. He fought for her when no one else would. The room fell silent. Some doctors still looked skeptical, others uncomfortable. But then the shepherd stirred again, his muscles tensed, his body trembling from weakness. With the last of his strength, he lifted his head, his dull eyes scanning the room. He didn't fight. He didn't growl. He just looked. And when his gaze found Emily's again, something inside her cracked wide open. The weight of that look, filled with pain, trust, and a silent question, made her throat tighten. She dropped to her knees beside him, running a shaking hand through his blood-matted fur. "You're safe now," she whispered. "I promise." He exhaled shakily, as if holding on to that promise, as if he believed in her more than she believed in herself. And in that moment, Emily made a decision. Forget the rules, forget the debate. She wasn't going to let them die. Dr. Carter burst through the hospital doors, his coat half-buttoned, his face tense with urgency. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air as he rushed toward the scene, his breath catching at the sight before him. The German shepherd lay sprawled on the cold floor, his fur matted with blood, his chest rising in slow, ragged breaths. Beside him, the tiny puppy lay motionless, its body frighteningly still. Without hesitation, Carter dropped to his knees, pulling open his bag, his hands moving quickly, trained by years of experience. But beneath his focused exterior, there was an underlying sense of dread. He had seen dogs in rough shape before, but something about this one felt different. "We need to stabilize them," he muttered, checking the shepherd's pulse. "He's in bad shape, but he's a fighter." Emily nodded, pressing gauze against the shepherd's worst wounds. For the puppy, Carter placed 2 fingers against her tiny rib, cage, waiting. For a moment, nothing, then the faintest flutter beneath his fingertips. "She's barely holding on," he murmured. "We need warmth, fluids." As he moved, his fingers brushed against something cold and metallic beneath the dog's thick fur. His brow furrowed. He reached down carefully, pulling at the object tangled in the shepherd's collar. And then he saw it, a police K9 tag. His hands stilled, his heart pounded in his chest as he turned it over, reading the engraving. His throat tightened. This can't be right," he whispered, his face going pale. Emily noticed the shift in his demeanor. What? What is it?" Carter swallowed hard. His voice, normally so steady, was edged with disbelief. "This dog, he was declared dead months ago." The words hit like a thunderclap. Emily froze, her breath catching. Carter's eyes darkened as they swept over the shepherd's body, his mind piecing together the horrors this dog must have endured. He looked beyond the fresh wounds, now his trained eyes noticing the scars, buried beneath. Some old, some cruel, deep. This wasn't just a dog that had been injured. This was a dog that had been betrayed. This wasn't an accident, he said grimly. This dog didn't just go missing. He was left for dead. The weight of those words hung heavy in the air. A nurse standing nearby let out a soft gasp. But why would they do that? Carter exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. There are a lot of reasons a K9 would be abandoned. Maybe he got hurt in the line of duty and was considered useless to the force. Maybe someone... He hesitated, his jaw tightening. Maybe someone tried to get rid of him for a reason they don't want anyone to know. Emily's hands trembled as she looked down at the shepherd. He had been a protector, a guardian, a soldier, and yet, when he needed someone the most, the very people he had served had turned their backs on him. And still, even after all of that, he hadn't given up. Her gaze shifted to the puppy. "And the puppy?" she asked softly. "Not his biological pup," he confirmed. His voice was quieter now, filled with something almost like reverence. He found her alone, dying in the snow. And instead of leaving her behind, he carried her for miles, through a storm, through his own pain. Emily felt something tighten in her chest, an ache so deep it stole her breath. This German shepherd, this abandoned, betrayed soul, had every reason to let go, every reason to stop fighting, but he hadn't. Instead, he had chosen to save a life. Tears stung Emily's eyes. "He saved her," she whispered. Carter nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Even when no one saved him." The room was silent now, the weight of the truth pressing, and down on everyone. No longer was this just about a bleeding dog and a dying puppy. This was a story of loyalty beyond reason, of sacrifice, of a heart that refused to harden even after it had been broken. This wasn't just any dog. This was a warrior, and if he could fight through hell to save a life, then so could they. As Emily and Dr. Carter fought to keep the German shepherd and his fragile puppy alive, news of their arrival spread like wildfire. A nurse had taken a photo. The bloody dog, collapsed on the hospital floor, the tiny frostbitten puppy beside him. It was posted online with a simple caption: "A hero left behind, still fighting to save a life." And then, the world exploded. Within hours, the image went viral. Comments flooded in. Who would abandon a police canine? He risked his life for us, and they threw him away. Someone needs to be held accountable. Journalists picked up the story, and soon a relentless reporter named Daniel Hayes began digging deeper. What he uncovered made the outrage even worse. The shepherd hadn't just been lost, he had been discarded months ago. During a high-risk operation, the dog's handler had been critically injured. In the chaos, the German shepherd had gone missing. Instead of launching a search, the department made a cold decision. They marked him as unrecoverable, a term that meant one thing: he wasn't worth the effort. He had been abandoned, wounded, left to die. And yet, he hadn't. Somehow, despite his injuries, he had survived, alone, starving, suffering. And even after all of that, he had still chosen to protect, to carry a helpless soul through the storm, when no one had carried him. The internet erupted. Find the officers responsible. This dog is more of a hero than the people who left him. We owe him. Whatever it takes, he deserves a second chance. Within hours, a petition was created, demanding justice for the abandoned canine. A fundraiser was launched, a digital beacon of hope in the face of despair. Donations poured in, a tidal wave of support that swelled from hundreds to thousands. Then, tens of thousands, a testament to the power of collective compassion. Offers of help flooded the hospital, a deluge of resources and expertise. Animal rescues, veteran groups, even former canine handlers reached out, their voices a chorus of solidarity. The world was watching, its eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. And now the hospital faced a critical decision, a moral crossroads that would define their commitment to compassion. Dr. Carter glanced at Emily, exhaustion etched in his face, his eyes reflecting the weight of their responsibility. The shepherd's heartbeat was weak but steady, a fragile rhythm against the silence. The puppy, wrapped in warm blankets, had moved ever so slightly, a flicker of life in her tiny form. They weren't out of the woods, far from it, but they had a chance, a glimmer of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. But it would take more time, more care, more resources, a commitment that stretched beyond the boundaries of protocol and procedure. Emily looked at the messages pouring in on her phone, a constant stream of public outcry, the digital echo of a world demanding justice. But justice wasn't enough. They needed to save lives, to honor the shepherd's sacrifice. She met Dr. Carter's gaze, her voice unwavering, her resolve as solid as the steel table before them. "We don't let him die." Carter exhaled, his shoulders sagging with the weight of it all, the burden of responsibility settling upon him. Then, slowly, deliberately, he nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. No more abandonment. No more betrayal. This time, the world would fight for him. The room was heavy with the scent of antiseptic, a sterile aroma that couldn't mask the undeniable weight of grief that filled the air, a palpable sense of loss. Machines beeped steadily, their rhythmic pulses a stark reminder of the fragile lives hanging in the balance. But all eyes were fixed on the fragile puppy lying. Beneath the hospital's bright lights, her tiny form a beacon of vulnerability. Emily hovered over her, her fingers trembling as she monitored the tiny heartbeat that had become more erratic with each passing hour, a frantic rhythm against the silence. The puppy had been fighting, her spirit tenacious, but her frail body had endured too much. The storm, the cold, the hunger, a relentless assault that had left scars too deep to heal. Beside her, the German shepherd whimpered softly, his weary body pressed against the cold steel table, his golden brown eyes locked on his tiny companion, his gaze filled with a silent plea. He licked the puppy's fragile head, his breath shaky, as if whispering a desperate prayer. "Stay, fight, please don't leave me too." Dr. Carter worked tirelessly, his jaw clenched, his hands moving with precision, a symphony of practiced movements. He refused to accept what the numbers on the monitor were telling him, the grim prognosis that hung heavy in the air. The world was watching. Donations had poured in. People had begged them to save these two souls, their voices a collective plea for compassion. And yet, fate had no mercy, its hand relentless and unforgiving. The room fell silent as the puppy exhaled one final, shallow breath. Then nothing. No movement, no sound, no life. Emily froze, her own breath caught in her throat, a small sob escaping her lips, a silent cry of grief. A nurse in the corner let out a soft gasp, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. Dr. Carter pulled back, his head hanging low. His shoulders slumped in defeat as the steady beep of the monitor turned into a long, unforgiving tone. A flat line that echoed through the room. The puppy was gone, her fragile life extinguished. A whimper broke the silence, a heart-wrenching sound that echoed through the sterile room. The German shepherd nudged the lifeless body, licking her tiny, fur-covered face with slow, desperate movements. His ears flattened, his body trembling, his spirit broken. He let out another soft cry, low and sorrowful, a primal lament. But the puppy didn't stir, her body still and cold. And then something shifted, a subtle change that sent a chill through the room. The shepherd's breathing, already shallow, became weaker, his body sagging against the table. His golden eyes, filled with so much pain, began to dim, their light fading into the shadows. His body, exhausted beyond repair, had been holding on for her, his spirit tethered to hers. And now, with nothing left to fight for, he let go, his resolve finally broken. A long, heart-wrenching howl filled the room, a sound so raw, so filled with agony that it seemed to echo through every person watching. A primal cry of grief that resonated with the deepest parts of their souls. Emily reached for him, her fingers tangling in his fur, her touch desperate and pleading. "No, please," she whispered, her voice breaking, her eyes filled with tears. "You can't." His body shuddered one last time, a final tremor of life. His eyes fluttered closed, and then, just like the tiny soul he had fought so hard to save, he was gone, his spirit finally released from its earthly bonds. The world watched in silence, a collective gasp echoing through the digital realm, as a warrior had fought his last battle, a father had given his last breath, and in the end, they had left. Their story a poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of love. Together, the world did not forget. In the days that followed, the hospital was overwhelmed with an outpouring of grief and compassion. Flowers, letters, and donations flooded the building, a tangible expression of the collective sorrow and admiration that had swept across the globe. People from every corner of the world mourned the loss of the brave German shepherd and his tiny companion, their story having touched hearts in ways no one could have ever imagined, resonating with a universal longing for loyalty and sacrifice. The police department, unable to ignore the deafening outcry, was forced to respond. their silence shattered by the weight of public pressure. They issued a statement, a carefully worded acknowledgement of their failure, a rare admission of guilt that echoed with the weight of their negligence. But words were not enough. A movement had begun, a groundswell of righteous indignation that demanded change. Protesters gathered, their voices a unified roar against injustice. Former K9 handlers spoke out, their testimonies filled with grief and anger. Lawmakers took notice, their attention drawn to the raw emotion that had gripped the nation. Then, a proposal, a beacon of hope amidst the darkness. A new law, one that would ensure no K9 officer would ever be abandoned again. A safeguard against the betrayal that had claimed 2 innocent lives. Every working dog, wounded or retired, would receive proper care, rehabilitation, and a loving home. A promise that no more forgotten heroes would be left to suffer. No more discarded warriors would be left to die alone. Emily, though shattered by the loss, her heart heavy with grief, refused to let their story end in sorrow alone, to let their sacrifice be in vain. Honoring the shepherd's spirit, she visited an animal shelter, a sanctuary for lost and abandoned souls, and found a frightened, neglected puppy, a soul in need of saving, a mirror of the one the shepherd had tried so desperately to protect. She adopted him that day, giving him the love and care that the fallen hero had fought so hard to give others, a living testament to his enduring legacy. Weeks later, a statue was unveiled, a bronze figure of the German shepherd standing tall, his gaze forever watchful, his posture a symbol of unwavering loyalty. Beneath it, an inscription, etched in stone, a tribute to his unwavering devotion, a hero never abandoned, a love never forgotten. And so, his legacy lived on, not just in the memories of those who mourned him, but in the tangible changes he had inspired, in the lives he had touched. And that, my friends, is the heartbreaking yet powerful story of a hero who was abandoned, but never stopped fighting, a testament to the enduring power of love and sacrifice. His sacrifice shook the world, igniting change and ensuring that no K9 would ever be left behind again. A legacy that would forever alter the landscape of animal welfare. If this story touched your heart, if it resonated with the depths of your compassion, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Wilderness for more emotional and gripping tales from the wild, stories that remind us of the resilience, loyalty, and love that animals bring into our lives, the profound connections that bind us to the natural world. Until next time, stay strong, stay compassionate, and never forget that true heroes come in all forms, their courage and love shining brightly even in the darkest of times.